Both.
Okay, great. So Ted, please just let me know if I just should start.
You can start. No, go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, so I hope people are back from the short break. So welcome everybody to the second part of my lecture in this virtual summer school on trend attribution. So what we're going to do today, to continue from what we did tomorrow, what we did yesterday, I would like to spend roughly the first half of today's lecture on fingerprinting, which is basically the state of the art and most widely used technique for detection attribution. And this has basically two parts. One is so-called non-optimal fingerprinting. I'll explain in a second what this is. And then a second part on optimal fingerprinting. And then I would like to use the last half hour or so of this lecture today to talk about kind of a few kind of non-standard approaches that have been used that are partly rooted in really old ideas, but also with new techniques being used more recently. And these non-standard approaches are kind of relate to dynamical adjustment, so splitting into dynamical versus thermodynamical trends, to use basically pattern recognition techniques that do what is called a signal to noise, maximizing pattern filtering, and basically as the last part, a few approaches to use or to bring in kind of statistical and machine learning to extract the forced response. I'm not sure if we get through all of these things, but if we don't get, just in case we don't get through them all, I also have some links to further information such that in this case, you could look at them by yourself. So I just would like to invite you also to always ask questions if there are questions arise, and then we can hopefully take the time also to discuss. So I wanted to start with this. So yesterday, I presented mainly kind of conceptual thoughts on detection attribution, and mainly kind of the examples I brought up were, I think all of them were based on the global mean detection attribution and global mean simulations, or kind of analysis of the global mean in climate model simulations. However, this idea of fingerprinting, and that there's basically you can use fingerprinting for detection, you can use fingerprinting also for attribution, but the idea of this fingerprinting is really to bring in different signals than just the global mean. So the idea is to bring in kind of spatial or spatiotemporal or vertical information of the atmosphere in order to basically to have a better understanding of and a better information on the signals we are looking at. And this idea, in fact, is really old, and it relates back to kind of 43-year-old work now by Klaus Hasselmann. Klaus Hasselmann, I have his picture here. So he got the Nobel Prize in Physics as with two other people last year in autumn, and he got it partly for his work on detection and attribution. And I think it's really remarkable what he said in a paper in 1979. Namely, he said it is necessary to regard the signal and noise fields as multidimensional vector quantities, and the significance analysis should accordingly be carried out with respect to this multivariate statistical field rather than in terms of individual grid point statistics. So I do think that's remarkable, because he's essentially in 1979 saying that we need to use kind of spatial or vertical information, because this is where we see distinct physical signals. And that's also part of the reason why I showed you yesterday in the introduction, some of these signals where we see kind of different trends in the troposphere and in the stratosphere, or different trends over land and the ocean. So here's exactly basically what he means with that is exactly that we have to look at these large scale signals rather than individual grid point statistics. And he's also saying things about attribution. So that's from a paper in 1997, where he's saying attribution analysis are necessarily limited to tests of consistency. So even if it has been shown that a detected climate change signal is consistent within a finite set of candidate mechanisms, it can never be ruled out that there exist other overlooked forcing mechanisms that could also produce the observed climate change signal. So he's basically saying what we also discussed yesterday a little bit, that we can use our physical understanding to come up with the most likely drivers, but and kind of to determine causality based on the most likely forcing mechanisms, how we understand them based on the physics. But we can never really basically with full certainty exclude that there may be other mechanisms that we have overlooked to some extent. So I think these two statements are really remarkable. That's why I wanted to show them here. Now, how does this fingerprinting work? So I just wanted to show, and this is now based on an older IPCC report, because these fingerprints, they are still being used widely, but they that apparently are not shown in the more recent IPCC reports. So the idea of these fingerprints is really to look at the spatial or the vertical structure of signals. And this is just an illustration of how the structure looks like. So these fingerprints are both based on climate model simulations. So they, again, this is temperature change. They show the estimated linear temperature change from 1890 to 1990 based on climate model simulations at the time for this IPCC report in 27. And this is basically showing the spatial structure of the atmosphere. So here on the y-axis, you see the vertical structure, and on the x-axis, you see latitudes. And what we see here for green, so this is the fingerprint for greenhouse gas simulations alone. And what we're seeing is that the effect of greenhouse gases is of course, they do warm the surface, but they have an even partly larger warming signature in the troposphere. But then they do have a cooling signature in the stratosphere. That's the same thing we saw yesterday in the observations. But now this is what the climate model is telling us what we should expect for greenhouse gas-induced temperature changes. Now we can look at two other fingerprints, and I just show them here as an illustration. So we can look at solar forcing, for example, and we see if we would change the intensity of the sun, of course, only in a climate model, we would see that actually the solar forcing fingerprint induces some warming basically across the troposphere and the stratosphere. So this is a distinct difference to what the greenhouse gas fingerprint is doing. And for the aerosol, we see kind of, in a sense, an opposite signal to the greenhouse gas fingerprint, namely that the aerosols are cooling the troposphere, but they have kind of a different signal in the stratosphere. So the idea of showing these fingerprints is really just to say this fingerprinting detection attribution is basically, the idea is for this hypothesis test that we are going to do is that we use this as basically specifying our hypothesis for detection attribution based on some spatial, it can be spatial, it can be vertical. So in this case, I guess it's latitudinal and vertical information, but it could also be just spatial information. It could also be temporal information, or it could also be multivariate patterns of change, which are different for different forcings. And that's basically the physical motivation or argument that we're then going to use to say, well, we can actually distinguish these different signals. Now I'll get to the general assumptions of fingerprinting. So there are some assumptions, of course, that come with these types of algorithms. So these assumptions include that, well, we assume that we have the key forcings identified. That relates back to the statement of Klaus Hasselmann. Most of these algorithms, or actually all of them, how they are being used are linear algorithm, and they assume a certain additivity. So we assume that the signals that we want to distinguish, so for example, greenhouse gases and aerosols, that they relate in an additive way. And also we assume that the noise is relating in an additive way to these fingerprints. So that's basically very much going back to what we discussed yesterday about this force response conceptual model plus the internal variability imposed on it. And also we have to assume that these large scale patterns of responses, so what I mean by that are just the fingerprints, so these large scale patterns, that these large scale patterns are correctly simulated by the climate models. And then as a last assumption, we have to assume, and that's something we discussed yesterday also with the questions, that we need to do an evaluation of internal variability to see if this internal variability as simulated by the models is consistent with observations. So this relates back to the noise model we discussed yesterday at the end of the lecture. And with that, I would like to introduce one algorithm that's called non-optimal fingerprinting. It's maybe not such a nice name because non-optimal somehow doesn't sound so good, but this is really not true. It just means that there's no optimization of signal against noise. So in a sense, one is trying to detect the signal in a good direction, but not exactly in this direction that the noise is. So this is not kind of doing a signal to noise optimization, but it looks in the respective direction of the signal. So that's why it's called sometimes non-optimal fingerprinting, but I wanted to say that it comes with kind of fewer statistical assumptions, and that's why it's still a widely used method, and I think for good reasons. And in many cases, the signals we are looking at are strong enough that they are kind of easily detectable, also if it's not kind of in a technically signal to noise optimized way. Would be better to call it non-optimized. Yes, probably yes. I just called it non-optimal because I think detection attribution people are calling it non-optimal, but I'm not even sure about this anymore. I would have to look that up again. Anyway, so the idea of this fingerprinting algorithm is that these fingerprints, again, they are sought to encapsulate in a physics-informed way the change signals from model simulations. So in a sense, they are sought to encapsulate the force response. And that's kind of the first step, that we have to define a fingerprint. So I wanted to just show this with a simple, basically spatial warming pattern from a paper this fingerprint comes from a paper from Ben Santer in PNAS in 2012, and he applies this fingerprint in a paper from 2019 in Nature Climate Change. And so he basically specifies this fingerprint. Typically, this could be, in the simplest case, just the spatial warming pattern. In some cases, one uses basically the multimodal average across space, so the pattern of the multimodal average, and then does an EOF analysis to see how basically the main component of this pattern evolves. But you could think of it as basically the forced signature. And in most cases, this non-optimal or this non-optimized fingerprinting relates to simply a sort of projection, or you could even think of a multiplication of this forced pattern. So this is the F here with the observations in order to see. So, or you could also alternatively, you could think of it as a spatial covariance, or sometimes it's even being used as a spatial correlation. But technically, it's a projection of the force response onto, or of the observations onto this force response pattern. So in a sense, you're basically comparing the pattern of change you're seeing in the observations. That again, of course, includes internal variability, but it also includes force response. And you're basically comparing it with the force response itself from the models. And then you basically you normalize it in some way, and then you end up with kind of a signal that kind of gives you the strengths at which the observations are basically becoming similar to the force response of the and this is typically then being compared with pre-industrial control simulations, so simulations that do not contain a force response, that are also projected onto this fingerprint. And of course, if they do not contain a force response, there should be no similarities, or any similarities should just occur by chance. So what we can do is, of course, we can then use this S we get from the observations as a test statistic to compare it to the projections of the pre-industrial control simulations onto this force response, and see whether the observations are basically exceeding the variability of the distribution of the pre-industrial control simulation. So very much as we did yesterday, but yesterday we did it for the global mean statistic, and now we're doing it for this kind of pattern-based statistic. And what comes out for this, so this fingerprint, sorry, I should have said that, that's basically lower tropospheric warming inferred from satellites. And if he, meaning Ben Santer, if he computes this, how over time now this S evolves, so for different trend lengths, so you see the X is now the trend length, so 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, up to 40 years from 1979 to 2018. And then he basically looks how the signal exceeds the noise of the control simulations. He's basically saying, well, in 3 different satellite-based temperature data sets, he's showing that the signal to noise ratio on a global scale exceeds basically 3 sigma by a 20 year for like after 20 years. So it has exceeded 3 sigma around early 2000. And it appears to exceed 5 sigma compared to the control distribution of the climate models by 2018. And the title of this 2019 Nature Climate Change paper, or one of the statements, was that, well, this is the climate change signal is exceeding in temperature, it's exceeding a 5 sigma threshold against the noise of internal variability now. I wanted to kind of provide a second example for the non-optimized, non-optimal fingerprinting, and that's a water cycle example, just because I think this method is quite instructive and also in a way intuitive to understand. So I just wanted to illustrate this for a different kind of fingerprint in that way. So now it's not a spatial pattern, it's also not a vertical pattern. And this is based on a paper from Kate Marvel in 2013 in PNAS. And the fingerprint here consists of a number of metrics that are basically sought to characterize important large-scale changes in the water cycle. So what she uses as a fingerprint now is not a spatial pattern, but it's basically the precipitation intensity changes at local precipitation extrema. So local meaning zonal precipitation. So you see here a distribution of the latitudinal precipitation. So of course you see here in blue, these are the mid-latitude storm tracks, these are the subtropical dry zones and so forth. And so she's basically having these indicators, or defining these indicators as precipitation intensity change at these mid-latitude storm tracks, at the subtropical dry zones, and in the core tropics. And then she also has some latitudinal shifts. So at these half max points here, so these points between the maximum and the minimum, she looks at how these basically latitudes are changing, and she calls this basically dynamical indicators of change based on some reasoning. But I found this fingerprint interesting because it's not a spatial pattern, and now she can basically define these combinations of these 11 points as her fingerprint essentially, and she can look in the models how in the models basically this fingerprint changes under greenhouse gas forcing, and that's what she called what she calls the force pattern across models of precipitation change. And so again, she computes an EUF across basically the multi-model average change. And so she shows the EUF loadings here, and she's basically showing that the core tropics and the mid-latitude storm tracks, they increase precipitation intensity. That's, I think, what would be expected under greenhouse gas warming. However, the subtropical dry zones, they tend to decrease the precipitation intensity. And then these arrows are basically these dynamical indicators where she shows that there's a tendency of basically all these points of going outwards, which I think is kind of dynamically related to the Hadley cell expansion, but I think Ted could explain this much better. But anyway, that's what she sees in the climate models. And if she does now this projection where she projects the historical simulations of the model, so those that contain internal variability, onto this fingerprint of change, she actually sees again this increasing trend slope. So meaning that the models, they basically have a positive association with this EUF pattern, or if you want to call it fingerprint, you can call it fingerprint. And of course, she can then use this fingerprint to look into pre-industrial control simulations, which she's doing here. And here she shows that this EUF of control simulations, she looks at how this projections of the control simulation basically relates to changes in this fingerprint. She actually shows that these control simulations also have a variability that can be similar. So these control simulations also have, of course, variations in the core tropics that seem to be associated with variation in the mid-latitude storm tracks and average. However, these control simulations, as shown here, the temporal amplitude is not an upward trend, but of course, this is essentially random because there's no force change in the climate models. And what she can do now as the final step in this fingerprinting attribution analysis is that she can go, of course, and now she can project the observations onto this fingerprint of the leading noise, of the leading signal mode. That's what she's doing here. So she arrives at a time series from 1980 onwards and showing this projection, so showing this S, what we had before in this equation, so this signal statistic, and she basically shows how, of course, there's variability in this metric, but she shows how basically there's an increasing trend. So again, the observations are noisy, but they tend to show what the models basically predict as the basically forced mode of precipitation change. And then she can compare this trend slope here. So she computes simply the trend slope of this red line here, and this is what is shown here in the figure to the right as this vertical line. So again, this is converted to a signal to noise ratio compared to all these kind of projections based on the control simulations that show these different distribution depending on, so this blue distribution here is the pre-industrial control simulations, and then she has a number of different distribution. And what she ends up with is that the red line for the observation here, this red vertical line, tends to fall into the tail. So it just exceeds a signal to noise ratio of 2 compared to these pre-industrial control simulations. But it seems to be consistent with this green distribution here, which shows basically the all forcing simulations for the CMIP5 models used in this case. So that's basically a simple, but I think very nice example of how this so-called non-optimized fingerprinting works. I wanted to ask if there are any questions up to this point, And if not, I would go on with optimal fingerprinting.
I think we're okay. Don't see anything.
Okay.
Don't
Fantastic.
hesitate to hold up your hand if you want to clarify
Yes.
something. All right.
Okay, we can also discuss later if there's any questions. So now I wanted to spend, let's say, the next 10 minutes or so on optimal fingerprinting, but I wanted to say before we go into that, this can only be a very, very coarse overview. I still wanted to show it in order to give you a feeling for how optimal fingerprinting works, but I must say that the statistical algorithm is quite basically being developed since about 20 years. So there's a lot of statistical specifics to it. If you want to use this algorithm, you will have to basically read up on the statistical literature on that anyway. But I think for understanding what attribution studies are about, I would hope that I can get like this broad overview across. So the idea of this optimal fingerprinting is indicated already, and that's basically to the right here. You see an illustration from this Hasselmann 1979 paper, so that's more than 40 years old. And there he's basically saying already that this G here is essentially the direction that we would call like the direction of the fingerprint. So this is basically he calls that guessed response. So that's basically our physics informed or model informed understanding of in which direction a forced change would occur here in this case, kind of thinking about geometrically in a two-dimensional problem. And then he's saying, well, and then of course there's a noise ellipsoid in a two dimensions. That's an ellipsoid. Of course, in reality we're dealing with much higher dimensions. And so then he's saying, well, just looking into the direction of the signal as we did in the non-optimized fingerprinting, maybe not enough. I mean, I tend to think that today the signal is strong enough that maybe even enough. But in 1979, when there was almost no global mean surface temperature warming, I mean, Klaus Hasselmann clearly said that, well, in order to see like basically more nuanced signals happening, we need to kind of look into an optimal direction. So a direction that basically strikes the optimal balance to basically optimize our signal to noise ratio. And he basically illustrates this direction in this two-dimensional case. So optimal fingerprinting optimizes, or you could also think of a rotation. If you have worked with EOF analysis, for example, that's kind of sometimes it relates to that as an example. So you could also think of basically rotating your data into the direction in which kind of the signal is detected against internal variability in an optimal way. If you believe you have a good understanding of the covariant structure of internal variability. Now, the way optimal fingerprinting is framed in the literature of the last 20 years or so is that it's framed as a regression problem in which these model fingerprints, so for example, these space-time fingerprints or spatial fingerprints, are basically used as predictors in a linear regression model to interpret the observations. And this may sound a bit abstract, but I wanted to give an example, basically based on a small schematic, and that's taken from a paper by Gabi Hegel in 2011. And if you're curious or you want to kind of in your PhD research to go in this direction of optimal fingerprinting, this is the one paper that I would recommend to, where you get kind of an easy reading of how this algorithm works before you dive into the more specific statistical literature. So the idea is of this optimal fingerprinting now that you have an observed pattern in some way. And so this is just illustrated here, and it also illustrates that in the real world, our observations have a lot of gaps and so forth, but you have data in different locations of the world. And the idea is now to try to explain that the observed trend, for example, or basically the time series of the observations as a combination of different forcings. So you could think of a linear model. So you would have this alpha 1 times this pattern. So this pattern could be, for example, your greenhouse gas fingerprint. So the signal you expect for greenhouse gases, and this alpha 2, this pattern related to it, could be the signal you expect for natural variability that you have from, let's say, from a simulation with climate models that include volcanoes and solar forcing, plus some internal climate variability that you're not going to that you don't really have a good feeling for. So basically, that will be the residual part in the regression model. And the idea now is that these alpha 1 and alpha 2, so your two regression coefficients in this case, they are called scaling factors. And the idea is, if you end up with a scaling factor of 1, that means that your greenhouse gas pattern from the models has the right magnitude in order to, in a sense, explain the observations. If you would end up with a scaling factor of 0, it means that you don't find any signal of your greenhouse gas fingerprint into the observations. And so if you look at the results of these optimal fingerprinting studies, you typically end up with these plots of these scaling factors. So these red illustration here would be the scaling factor for temperature change in this case. So for the red one is for greenhouse gases, and the green one is for aerosols in this illustration, and the blue one is for natural variability. So really, the idea is to have this as a regression model. So just to repeat this, optimal fingerprinting is framed as this regression problem in which these model fingerprints, and they could be spatial patterns as in this illustration, or they could be space-time patterns, or they could include a vertical dimension. And these are taken to interpret the observations in a linear model. It's not an ordinary least squares regression. So I will kind of talk about this briefly, but in a sense that you could still see it as a linear regression model. So this Y, again, it would be the observations. The matrix X here would be basically your expected changes. So it would be the space-time. It would be basically a collection of your different fingerprints. And these betas here, which are the same as the alphas here, are those regression coefficients for your specific forcing I, so greenhouse gases, natural forcings, etc. So they would be called these scaling factors. And this epsilon here is internal variability. And the goal now, this statistical goal now, is to estimate these scaling factors and their confidence intervals. And the confidence intervals here, they are actually quite important because they are the way to relate this regression model back to this conceptual idea of detection attribution that we talked about yesterday. So in this optimal fingerprinting, and this is just here in this figure, is a collection for anthropogenic and natural scaling factors from a very recent paper for the CM6 models. And it's these scaling factors, I should say, are converted to the attributable change of basically temperature change of 2010 to 2019 versus a very early decade. And the idea now is to say, and you see the scaling factors here for each model separately and the respective confidence intervals. And the idea now is to say, well, if I can claim detection if these scaling factors do not include 0 in their confidence intervals. So if they do not include 0, that's basically the equivalent to saying they are inconsistent with internal variability, because if they do not include 0, it means that I really need this forcing in order to, so this forcing really has an effect in my observations. And they're called scaling factors, of course, because they scale the magnitude of the different climate models. And now, if you are able to achieve detection by basically having a confidence interval that doesn't include 0, you can then try to think about attribution. And this attribution is typically sort of being achieved when those scaling factors include 1 in their confidence interval. So if you can say, well, there's no reason to believe that basically the correspondence in the magnitude between my fingerprint and what I am seeing in the observations, when the 1 is included, meaning that the simulated magnitude could correspond to the magnitude that I'm seeing in the observations. So these scaling factors, and if you end up with a scaling factors that's substantially above 1, say, then it means that the model is basically under simulating the magnitude of the respective observations. And if you end up with a scaling factor that's between 0 and 1, then it means that the model is essentially, you need to scale down the response in the models in order to explain the observations, or in other words, the models are overestimating what the observations show. So the idea of these scaling factors is that with optimal fingerprinting, we can not only say something about detection or attribution, but we can also say something about the amplitude information about a respective forcing. Now, I hope that this is relatively clear now and intuitive, but I should say that this statistical algorithm, so this optimal fingerprinting, is in a sense It is state of the art for detection attribution. However, I should say that there are a lot of basically statistical specifics that I'm not going to go into, but I still want to mention some of them, that you are aware that this is not just basically an ordinary least squares regression problem. So one problem is that this is a small sample statistical problem, because in the end we have a very large number of predictors, or a very large numbers of dimensions, because we have a very large number of locations across the globe where we have data from. And all these locations are highly spatiotemporally correlated in some way. So in order to get a statistically valid confidence interval, we have to be very careful about in which dimensionality we basically do the regression here. So there are questions that relate to how we deal with internal variability and how we deal with these scaling factors. Now, this optimal part in optimal fingerprinting means that this regression, as I said, is performed in a basically signal to noise maximized or rotated space. And this is derived through estimating the covariance matrix of internal variability. And typically this regression is then performed in a dimension reduced space because of this high dimensionality of the problem. So you need to, before you run this algorithm, you need to have a good way to estimate the covariance matrix of internal variability. And this is kind of in the standard way it's done in model simulations of internal variability. So again, you have to trust the internal variability. And then this is then combined with a dimension reduction because of the high dimensionality of the problem. Now this uncertainty, then you can run your regression, and the uncertainty in the scaling factors, they must be assessed then with a second statistically independent estimate of the covariance matrix. So you cannot just use all the data for internal variability simulations you have to estimate the covariance matrix, but you need to basically to keep a second set to estimate an independent covariance matrix. Otherwise, you run into biases in your confidence intervals. Now, there are different algorithms to solve this regression problem. As I said, it's typically not ordinary least squares. And these different algorithms relate to different estimates of that, or different assumptions that you make about error structures. And then as a last point that I want to say is, before you can claim attribution, you have to make sure, so just repeating myself, that the residual variance you get, so this epsilon in your fit, so that's basically the residual variance that you cannot explain in observations. This must be consistent with the model estimated internal variability, and that's typically tested in a kind of statistical test that's called a residual consistency test. So testing if the residuals are consistent with internal variability as simulated by the models. And with that, I would like to summarize my very brief introduction into fingerprinting. So again, the goal, and that's really the most important point that I want to get across, the goal of these fingerprinting studies is to test whether a fingerprint, so spatial, temporal, vertical, multivariate, etc., of a given external forcing that's usually given by a physics-based climate models. It can also be something else, but in most cases it's a physics-based climate models, but sometimes it can be an energy balance model, for example, as well. The goal is then that this fingerprint can be shown to have influenced the observations, and these non-optimized methods are based on projections onto basically the signal vector. Sometimes they are also based on pattern correlations, and then basically seeing if internal simulations without force changes have a different distribution. And then optimal fingerprinting basically aims to test for the different external influences in this signal to noise optimized space. And with that, I would conclude this part on the fingerprinting, and I hope you got an impression, but I still wanted to give the opportunity to ask questions that arise spontaneously. Otherwise I'm happy to chat later as well. Okay. If there's nothing right now, I would like to kind of make a brief overview, I think 25 minutes or something on these non-standard approaches.
Maybe I'll just jump in. I'm trying to hold back, but it seems like, is this all done? Is the fingerprinting, it sounds like it should be done in a Bayesian approach, and basically this regression is something like a likelihood function or something like that, and Bayes factors. Is that being done? Or of course you're sort of presenting it as a null hypothesis kind of approach, which is, you know, definitive, when you can make a definitive statement. But in many cases, it may not be a definitive statement, and actually there could be a, so have people, did they originally cast it in that framework, do you know, or are people working in that area?
Yeah, so I know that people are working in that area. I also know that there are a few papers on doing it in a Bayesian way. So I know this is being done, but I must admit I'm not at all an expert on Bayesian statistics, so I cannot really judge whether this is. It sounds like, so I absolutely agree with you that it sounds like that this is definitely a problem that can be treated in a Bayesian way, and I know this is done. I know 2 or 3 papers that have basically done it, but the kind of the standard way that's basically mostly referred to in IPCC reports and so forth is still this, in a sense, null hypothesis way. Whereas, of course, the null hypothesis is not based on statistics, but on a noise model that comes from the climate models. So sorry, this is a bit of an unsatisfactory answer, but this is kind of.
But it sounds to me like it's ripe for that sort of interpretation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So in this last part on this non-standard approach, I just wanted to briefly showcase a few applications that are not doing fingerprinting or anything like that, but that still try to understand a little bit better what parts of the climate records that we see are forced or are maybe internal variability. And one such approach, and that relates very much to what Aglaé has presented about event attribution, is this dynamical adjustment. That means basically trying to separate dynamical versus thermodynamical trends, because that may help us in identifying basically where these trends may originate from. So again, going back to the Claradesa, we have seen that regional climate trends really are affected a lot by internal variability, and that's all what I wanted to say with that slide. And of course, one could have the idea, and this idea is in fact very old. I think it goes back for at least half a century or so, to see what is going on in terms of variability, to see this as a superposition of a dynamical component, so essentially weather variations aggregated over longer times, and a thermodynamical component that may be due to thermodynamical feedbacks, but that may also be due to the forced response. And the idea of this dynamical adjustment is to extract basically regional climate signals by using circulation information. So, and if you want to read up on that, there's a very in-depth introduction to dynamical adjustment published by the Claradesa, again, in Journal of Climate. And I just wanted to illustrate one example. So I've put this here as, if you wish, as a somewhat a hypothesized causal model. So the idea is that we have a target variable, say temperature or precipitation, that we want to understand better, and we could see this, or that's the way how dynamical adjustment would see this, as a combination of an influence of atmospheric circulation that basically has a large amount of circulation-induced variability, and some external forcing that is basically kind of to first order, mainly affecting kind of the thermodynamical changes. And the idea is now of this dynamical adjustment that if we have a good proxy for the atmospheric circulation, say if we have a field of sea level pressure anomalies or something like that, then we may be able to build a statistical model that would basically give us an estimate of the variability due to circulation. And what we're doing here is we're using a statistical learning method, a very simple one, a linear one that's called ridge regression, that is essentially basically using a large scale sea level pressure field as a proxy for circulation, and tries to predict a temperature variable. And I wanted to show this for one brief example, and it's about winter climate change in Switzerland. So if we look at the cold season temperature anomaly in Switzerland, we actually see that it's quite noisy. Of course, we expect this. Winters are very variable, but it also looks like as if there would be a sort of a shift between 2 time periods. And at least it has been basically framed like this in scientific discussions where people kind of look at this shift. And to be very clear, I want to say I'm not at all advising to do kind of to look at mean shifts or things like that. I just did that here to illustrate that this is being done in many scientific publications, because apparently it somehow looks like that. And of course, it's also something that's discussed a lot in German newspapers that talk about skiing tourism in the future. And I would like to make the case now that dynamical adjustment may offer a much more intuitive and hopefully more physical explanation for these changes in these time series, rather than just fitting some statistical averages or breakpoints or things like that. So the idea of this dynamic adjustment, again, now you see in black again the time series of the Swiss average winter cold season time series, and in blue now you see basically the prediction that comes out of sea level pressure. So in a sense, you see the prediction that comes out of the field of sea level pressure variations. So that's related to circulation. And we see that a lot of the interannual variability is indeed explained by this blue line, by our prediction. And in fact, for example, the by far coldest winter that we have in the record, which is the last time that all these Swiss lakes were frozen in 1963, it has been clearly an effect of atmospheric circulation. And that's of course what one would expect. Now, the interesting thing is that this kind of hypothesized abrupt change in this temperature time series is also a feature of atmospheric circulation. And basically you see a few cold winters in the early 80s and then a few warm winters in the late 1980s that appear to be largely a phenomenon of atmospheric circulation. However, what happens kind of over the last 30 or 40 years is that there's a certain decoupling of the circulation. So the circulation still gets, of course, the interannual variability, but there's a certain offset that appears to be growing over time. Now, if you look at the residuals, so the difference between the black and the blue line, we actually see that the residuals are actually, and we would expect that they contain the thermodynamical signal of change. So these residuals really kind of show this increasing trend that we would, in a sense, expect as climate change is, in a sense, a gradual phenomenon. And so the idea is that this dynamical adjustment really gives us a more intuitive explanation of why this original time series appears to show such a jump in the first place. And we may not need to invoke any basically fancy breakpoints in the time series or anything like that. So this dynamical adjustment is a technique that's basically in the realm of detection attribution, where the idea is to decompose observed or simulated trends into their dynamical part and a residual part, where the residual part is thought to contain the thermodynamical trends. Of course, it may also contain other things. So this is not exactly, of course, a separation into forced and internal components, because there may be, of course, forced part in the dynamical signal, and there may be internal variability in the thermodynamical signal. But I would argue that it does help our understanding and our interpretation of basically climate trends on a regional scale, because we can kind of separately argue about thermodynamical and dynamical components of change. Now, as I said, this is an old idea, and various methods exist to do that. So kind of more traditional ways are based on circulation analogs. There are also basically methods that use EOFs or EOF regression, to be more specific. And more recently, statistical learning comes into place, where basically statistical learning is used to use basically pattern information in a statistical learning framework. And basically for this illustration, this apparent climate regime shift in Switzerland and in Europe, in fact, can be explained as a combination of an unusual atmospheric circulation trajectory combined with a smooth forced, or we argue forced, thermodynamical trend. And with that, I would like to come to the second basically outlook part. And the second kind of non-standard approach that I wanted to briefly highlight here is a thing that's called signal to noise maximizing pattern filtering. And that's again where these pattern recognition methods come into play. And this is really based on a collaboration and mainly a presentation from Rob Wills, who has worked on this topic specifically. And so I'm using his slides here. So it is, of course, very important to understand the differences across forced patterns from different climate models and observations. And in order to do that, of course, we need to isolate the forced response, the forced pattern again. So sometimes we're not only interested into kind of one-dimensional scalar statistic of the forced response, as with the dynamical adjustment or with the standard detection attribution, but sometimes we may want to look at what are actually the forced patterns and how do different models differ in their first patterns. And that's important, of course, for model evaluation. It's important for predicting feedbacks of climate sensitivity and of understanding multi-decadal variability. And so there are these pattern recognition methods that are used to separate these signals. And again, this is kind of something that's being done in these large ensembles, where you have not only one ensemble member, but several ones. And you basically aim to use a good statistical method to basically characterize the patterns that, in a sense, co-vary with the ensemble average. So if you have, say, CESM is a standard community climate model, and you have basically the ensemble average, but then on a local scale, you may have still a lot of variability around between different members, and then there it may not be so clear what is the force pattern. And so there are these pattern recognition methods that then give you a better estimate by basically finding the patterns that really co-vary with the ensemble average. Okay, and just I want to give one illustration for that. So of course, Klaus Hasselmann already warned us not to use grid cell statistics, but of course that's something that is still very widely being done. So we had a short basically opinion article where we looked at basically a signal to noise ratio in this CSM model, so in this community system model. And okay, we see that that there's a tendency that the signal to noise on a seasonal time scale, so basically the force signal versus internal variability is higher over the ocean, specifically over the tropical oceans and also over tropical land. And the signal to noise kind of tends to be low in the mid latitudes because, of course, a large influence of circulation and internal variability tends also to be lower over the equatorial Pacific. But of course, Klaus Hasselmann already told us in 1979 that we should not be using grid point statistics, which is essentially what we're looking at here. Instead, he said we should use the pattern information. And indeed, if we do compute these, what is called now signal to noise maximizing patterns, we can look at the signal to noise ratio of the signal to noise maximizing patterns. And again, the goal, I'm not going to explain all the statistics behind that, but the goal is to maximize, to get the signal to noise maximizing pattern by maximizing the ratio of ensemble mean signal to total variance in the entire data set, and basically to see which are the patterns that really do co-vary across individual ensemble members with the ensemble mean. And by using this technique, we actually see that if we look at these grid point statistics and their signal to noise ratios, we see that these grid points, they all cluster here. I mean, they do basically vary in terms of their signal to noise ratios. If you're smart and you use an ocean pixel somewhere in the tropics, then you may up with a signal to noise ratio of 1 or something like that. However, if you're using, say, the US mean surface temperature, you end up with a relatively low signal to noise ratio, which is exactly what we've seen from Clarissa yesterday. However, if you use a smart aggregation of the pattern, so the signal to noise maximizing pattern, we end up with this black dot here, which shows a substantially higher signal to noise ratio than any individual grid point, and it even shows a higher signal to noise ratio than if you just use, say, global mean surface temperature. So again, this leading signal to noise maximizing pattern has a signal to noise ratio that is higher still than the global mean surface temperature, and it's an order of magnitude higher than any grid point. So these are kind of more relatively modern, not super modern, but relatively modern techniques that can help you in identifying these forced patterns. Right, so this is the technique, how to come up with these signal to noise maximizing patterns. So just very briefly, it works the same way as, in a very similar way to standard detection attribution. So you also have a fingerprint of basically the highest signal to noise, and then you basically see how the time series associated with this fingerprint pattern, basically how this varies in individual ensemble members, and then you see how you can maximize this relative to the ensemble mean. And if you do this, you end up with basically just another projection of your data matrix, and then you end up with a signal to noise maximizing pattern that looks something like that. All right, that's what I wanted to say on these signal to noise maximizing patterns. And of course, it is a way to save computational time in a sense, because it basically shows that you can reveal information from a large ensemble that really is much more useful than just the ensemble average. So if you look at metrics that are affected a lot by internal variability, so for example, the Pacific east-west sea surface temperature gradient, that's something that's really important for climate feedbacks and for climate sensitivity. And now if you just compute a simple ensemble mean with 20 ensemble members, you end up with a quite noisy time series like that. However, if you do this pattern filtering, so again, by using this pattern information, you end up with something on the right-hand side here, where you see that you have a much better constraint of what is actually going on in your ensemble. There are, of course, also assumptions that come with this technique, but personally, I think it's quite elegant if you want to understand what the force patterns are in your models, at least. As a last point on the signal to noise maximizing pattern filtering, so this is just a map of how well you can how many ensemble members you need to identify basically a force temperature response that correlates relatively highly with the ensemble mean. And you need, with the simple, if you just compute ensemble averages across grid points, so the top figure again is grid point statistics, you see that in most locations of the globe, and especially in the mid-latitudes, we would need a really large number of ensemble members in order to achieve even a reasonable correlation with the ensemble mean. So this ensemble averaging it's good in theory, but it's not good in practice because it's just not very effective. However, if you do this pattern filtering, then a few ensemble members, so on the order of 5 or so, actually gives you a reasonably good estimate of the force response. So if it's about getting, let's say, regional patterns of force changes across different climate models, this is in my opinion a really useful pattern-based technique. So as a summary, this signal to noise maximizing pattern filtering is really a technique to extract patterns of the force response in large ensembles, or as I said, if you need only 4 or 5 ensemble members, then this is even applicable to things like CMIP6 simulations with a few ensemble members per model. And it basically uses statistics and more specifically pattern recognition techniques to do this filtering. It can be very helpful to understand structural uncertainties across climate models. And there exist certain extensions to apply a similar technique to observations, because the problem with observations is, of course, we only have one realization, so we cannot find patterns that somehow relate to the ensemble average because we don't have an ensemble average for observations, but we can try to find patterns that tend to co-vary with low frequency components, and then it does a relatively similar things. So just as a summary of those both non-standard approaches that I've shown, pattern filtering techniques and dynamic adjustment, they aim both to extract different forced and unforced, in the pattern filtering case, or dynamical versus thermodynamical components in the dynamic adjustment case. And thus they differ only in their assumptions they make about force responses. So in the sense of how they separate different timescales or what they assume about the influence of atmospheric circulation changes and so forth. So I guess I have maybe 8 minutes left. Is that right? Because we started 5 minutes late.
Yeah,
or how are
sure.
people? Okay. So there's a last approach that is kind of based on statistical or machine learning to extract the force response. So again, that's something that relates to that relates to classical detection attribution, but it tries to kind of bring in a new techniques to do that. And I would like to kind of highlight kind of one study that we did on that. So of course we can go back to Claradesa, and we know internal variability on a regional scale is really highly variable. So we should know that on a daily time scale or so, we should expect cold extremes still occur even though the background climate is warming. However, not everybody understands that, and so for example, Donald Trump and people like that still tweet things like if there's a cold wave, tweet things like there's a brutal and extended cold blast, and they kind of apparently pretend not to understand how this can happen under global warming. Of course, people are quick, so that's a journalist here, to respond and say, well, you missed America is all that matters, but climate is actually a global phenomenon. And then on a global weather map, it turns out that on this particular day, when North America was quite cold, or say the East Coast was quite cold, Earth as a whole was about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures on that particular day. Now we were seeing that, a few years ago, and we were wondering, can we actually, if these are kind of daily temperature maps from reanalysis, from the top row is the 1980s, the second row is the 1990s, and the bottom row is the 2010 decade, so just random days. And we were asking ourselves, can we identify, and that's something, of course, that relates very much to kind of traditional detection and attribution, can we identify a climate change signal in these individual daily temperature maps? So in a sense, we're now looking at individual days, but from a whole global perspective, because of course we know on a regional scale we couldn't do that. And we basically kind of came up with a detection method, so kind of in the spirit of traditional detection attribution, where the idea was, well, can we actually learn a fingerprint from climate model simulations if we say, well, we have a high dimensional linear regression model where we put basically in the climate models global daily temperature maps in here as the matrix of predictors. So every location in space, in a sense, is a predictor, and we're kind of seeking the fingerprint that predicts a target metric that's related to the forced response. So in our case, we used annual global mean temperatures. So we were seeking a fingerprint only across the climate models without seeing the observations to predict the forced response, essentially. And we used a regularized linear model here, and the regularization is just a way to reduce the dimensionality. So it's something that's also used in the optimal fingerprinting in order to have a good estimate of the covariance metric. So in a sense, that's another way where it relates closely to the traditional fingerprinting ideas. And then once we had kind of trained this basically set of fingerprints, or the set of regression coefficients, this spatiotemporal fingerprint, we then, in a second step, we projected the observations for individual days from reanalysis onto this fingerprint in order to obtain a climate change test statistic. So it's the exact same logic as we see in the traditional detection attribution, where we come up with a hypothesis from the climate models, and then we put in a second step the observations without having trained or fitted anything on the observations themselves. And what happens is, if you look at this map of regression coefficients, that's the map you see on top here, that's the fingerprint, that's apparently in a sense, based on the linear model, the optimal fingerprint to predict the forced response from individual based on out of this variability of the individual days. And what we're seeing here is that the coefficients over the land are really small. So they are in fact almost zero, because the land just has a lot of variability that's not helpful in this case. And of course, also the equatorial Pacific here has a muted response, because we know there's ENSO and things like that. So there's a lot of variability that's not related to the forced response. But it does indeed go into the tropical ocean regions in order to kind of maximize the signal over the noise. And if we look at the time series of this, in a sense, of our prediction, so of our prediction of the forced response, or for our prediction of annual global mean temperature based on these individual days, and each orange point you can see here is any individual day, we found that basically this statistic basically moved out of the distribution of internal variability of the CM5 models. So that's, in a sense, the box plot here is our noise models from an early period based on CM5, and the observations appear to be outside of this kind of climate model-based noise model since at least 12 years or so for any individual day. So based on that, we claimed that, well, there's detection at least since 2012 for any individual day. And of course, that's somehow also intuitive from a climate physics point of view, because we know the world has warmed. So even though variability and atmospheric circulations basically shift the warmth around a lot, but the warming still has to be somewhere. So it's may not be so surprising in the end that it's possible to detect this. Anyway, to summarize, the statistical learning-based detection attribution of global climate change, it does reveal also kind of, in a sense, a fingerprint of change that's a little bit different than the fingerprint in traditional detection attribution, but it follows a similar logic. And this approach in the illustration I presented allows an interpretation of short-term climate signals. And in that way, it kind of provides a link between traditional fingerprinting-based attribution and event attribution, in the sense that we look at any individual day on a global scale as an event. And as a last slide that I wanted to show today is that there are kind of, this technique is also being picked up more from a machine learning perspective rather than a statistical learning. So with statistical learning, I mean more this traditional statistics such as rich regression, having a regularization and so on, but not emphasizing so much the nonlinear aspects that machine learning emphasizes. But there is a very active group. That's the group led by Libby Barnes in Colorado, and she's doing relatively similar things where she's trying to basically predict metrics of the forced response out of the patterns of climate variables. So she has a paper that's called Viewing Forced Climate Patterns Through an AI Lens, which I think is a very nice illustration how she's kind of doing a very similar work. So trying based on patterns of climate variables, trying to predict as the output things that are related to the forced response or things that are thought to be related to the forced response. And she's using neural networks for this task instead of these linear pattern recognition or statistical learning methods. So that's something I would put on the reading list and make available for everyone, as well as all the other papers that I mentioned in this talk. So with that, I would like to close this lecture. I think we have covered a lot of different topics in these 2 hours, and I hope that this was okay as an overview. I mean, I admit that this was not too much in depth, so I hope that you would be able, based on this overview, to really do the reading, the in-depth reading in the topics that you're interested yourself. But I hope that the overview as such was useful. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for the attention, and I would invite you to ask questions. And I would also invite you, if there's anything that's unclear or so, to discuss with me or just drop me an email. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sebastian. And as Sebastian said, his email is there. I'm sure you can find him anyway. I know there's been a lot to take in, so I can imagine that it'll take some time for people to formulate some questions. And he'll be, well, we will all be making up a reading list. Sebastian's going to kick it off, I think. That'll be available within a few days as well. I don't see any hands or any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe any, like, if you have another minute or so, I mean, some general feedback would also be interesting. Was it too much? Was it too shallow? Was it just too much? I don't know. So for the next time, that would also help maybe to, but we can of course stop the recording now.
I think
have an offline.
Maybe, it's better actually, Sebastian, if I don't know if you'll be able to come on Friday for the afternoon session, but I think it would be good to look at the entire thing in context, probably, rather than, yeah, I mean, if absolutely. People have specific feedback, they can send it to you, but let's look at the whole week.